They say the most treasured folktales are often the most spellbinding, the secret ones that are often not spoken of. Dark and pervasive legends that twist our thoughts down the deepest, shadow-filled corridors of our minds. The thrill of conceptualizing such tales that could potentially blur the lines of disbelief and truth, all while taunting us with everlasting scars on our memories. Why do we crave such stories that we are unprepared to hear? Is it like a drug? An addiction? If what we hear can leave a lasting impression on us, why do we continue to risk encountering evil with every turn of the page? Students of the unexplained who flock to such murky and morbid retellings of deliciously dark chapters of our history can often recognize, of all the villains that could exist in our world, the Wendigo could be considered amongst the most abominable. Similar to that of an eclipse, rather than outshining its competitors, like a shadow, they would rather consume any and all light that has the potential to surround them. The spirit of the Wendigo is not one to be trifled with, nor one that should be dealt with lightly. The residents of an inconsequential hamlet nestled amongst a sea of golden fields know all too well of the encroaching dangers when a Wendigo sets its sights on a community. It seems no matter where this delectable folklore rears its ugly head, evil is undoubtedly bound to consume. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and welcome back to a new episode on the Moonlight Lore podcast. Cree and Algonquin traditions tell us those who are stricken with grief and despair are customarily susceptible to attracting a Wendigo. It's a fear many have had throughout their lives, always looking over their shoulders, wondering with panicked thoughts if the cannibalistic spirit was soon upon them. The gruesome acts it would coerce one to commit were unfathomable. While most would live out their days unimpeded by the dread that would come with encountering such a fearsome predator, many would still feel its looming presence, having been forever cast over the tribal settlements of North America, like a thick, unrelenting fog drifting under a forest canopy. Deep within the beating heart of Canada's west, where the edges of Alberta's verdant boreal forests kiss the ocean of sprawling farmland, a disturbing tale breaches the obscure chapters of history focused upon a small, isolated town known as Fort Kent. During the time this story unfolds, in the early icy winters of 1920, the small, bustling town of Fort Kent was faced with a not-so-unique problem that plagued many of the early settlements stationed in the West. Its population was waning. Its residents were packing up their lives in search of new beginnings and better opportunities. The logging and trapping industry was drying up. What was left was farm life, a path many were incapable or willing of adapting to. Perhaps, though, there was another reason why so many sought another life. Perhaps it wasn't the prospect of finding a new beginning, but rather simply a safer one. Connoisseurs of morbid fascination may realize the dark and pervasive history that surrounds the fabled forests of this once vibrant community. While so many fled from the town, something else entirely had moved into their place. The remaining residents quickly discovered they had a new neighbor, and it was starving. The feat of surviving the brutal, skin-gnawing prairie winters and the sharp winds that often accompany them makes for a life hard fought, made even worse so when the much relied on livestock suddenly disappears. At first, the ranchers may have believed a pack of vicious wolves had descended from the north, preying on their herds and flocks. Or maybe some uniquely brave coyotes were on the prowl, developing a new appetite for domesticated beasts. Regardless of what the culprit might have been, it was developing into a very worrisome problem. The few brave souls who attempted to guard and watch over their herds in the dead of night were never sure what new predator stalked the countryside. It remained elusive, hidden in the shadows under the night sky. Some had caught brisk glimpses of the nocturnal abomination darting from tree to tree, the moonlight briefly illuminating a mysterious figure as it shone through the gaps between the branches. Otherworldly howls beckoned out as warnings from the deepest depths of the woods, a deterrent for those who believed in the foolish notion of investigating the creature's domain. And piercing yellow eyes reflecting the soft glow of the moon above scoured the landscape, searching for new prey to satisfy its never-ending hunger. It was a precarious time for those who remained in the lonely hamlet, as further livestock were mysteriously disemboweled on the edge of the fields, as household pets suddenly vanished without a trace from the doorsteps of people's homes. The citizens of this once quiet community began to nervously wonder when exactly would they hear of a person falling prey to this predator, and if they might be next. Although things would continue to escalate over the coming weeks, the mystery would remain suspended, yet to be solved. As a united Fort Kent attempted to repel their deadly new neighbor, they found unexpected support in the form of two English immigrants, a Dr. Thomas Burton and his wife, Katie. Having experienced the nightmares and horrors that came with serving in the muddy trenches in Europe during the Great War, Dr. Burton had wanted a change of pace. Having seen what he thought was the worst of humanity had to offer, he believed retreating across the ocean and settling down in a calm, isolated community would put his shell-shocked mind and heart at ease, a way to forget the rotting corpses of the men he attempted to save but couldn't, to give his still ringing ears their deserved rest from the echoing blasts of cannon fire, and allow himself to fall into domestic bliss after collecting shattered nerves. In his mind, Fort Kent was supposed to be a refuge, but when he arrived, he realized his days of facing evil were yet to be behind him. With his experience as a combat medic, Burton and his wife were able to easily find steady work by establishing their own medical practice where they would serve the weakening community and offer up house calls to those too sick to travel. The residents of Fort Kent and the surrounding region were indebted for their efforts, and quite quickly, the two English immigrants found themselves as one of the few pillars that held up the small town. After years of struggle, Fort Kent losing half its population and a new fearsome predator roaming its borders, this was finally a win, and soon Dr. Burton and his talents would be put to the test. For some time, things seemed to have taken a turn for the better. Those who happened to suffer from disease or illness were healed. The town seemed to be thriving again, and whatever creature that had been hunting livestock seemed to have excused itself into the furthest reaches of the woods and away from the local population. However, this evidently was only a temporary relief. Soon, events in Fort Kent would abruptly take a turn for the worse. The calm before the storm, as it were. Shortly after Dr. Burton and Katie had established their practice, Fort Kent came under siege by an excruciating disease which proved to be quite lethal if gone untreated. People of all ages were inflicted, and despite all his best efforts, all the medicine at his disposal, and all the training and past experience he had, Dr. Burton could not identify nor cure this mysterious infection. It was as if the putrid smog of death itself had descended onto the town, lingering on the doorsteps of the residents, anticipating the moment it could seep into their very lungs. Burton knew whatever this disease was, it was something new, something he had never seen before. He quickly found himself far busier in the coming weeks than he had ever been since settling in the Great Plains. Likely it was reminiscent of his time spent in the rat-infested trenches at Flanders, rushing to the aid of fallen soldiers who pleaded with him to protect them from the ever-emerging white light. He saw the same look of terror and hopelessness in the eyes of those he swore to help in this welcoming community as he saw in his fellow Brit during the days of war. One evening, as he desperately sought a cure in his medical textbooks, scouring over the pages by the soft light of a lantern, hoping to discover what this infliction could possibly be, Burton suddenly received some grave news. The mortality rate was at 100%, so when he learned Katie had fallen victim to this sickness, the man was stricken with grief. He did everything in his power to save her. He poured all his spare time into ensuring his wife was comfortable, but no matter what he tried, like all the others before, Burton knew things were hopeless. She would die, and he would be left alone to deal with the aftermath. In time, Katie did pass away, and Thomas Burton was left alone on the prairies, sorrow and pain flooding his heart. There were residents in town who still needed his help. They were still alive and suffering. But now, deeply depressed, Burton refused to see them. He shut himself away, concealing and confining himself to the silent, empty home. The town was effectively hushed. While many still lied in their beds, ill or dying, the epidemic continued to spread. Hope that Fort Kent would endure was swiftly fading. If it wasn't for one singular man who had miraculously managed to avoid infection, hope in the suffering hamlet would have completely diminished. The situation had grown dire. His neighbors continued to fall ill, succumbing to painful, slow deaths, and a doctor who was in mourning and refused to help. He knew it was only a matter of time before everyone in town was beyond saving, including himself. The nearby settlements, Cold Lake to the east or Bonnyville in the west, which at the time was known as St. Louis de Moose Lake, would likely be able to supply the medical assistance Fort Kent needed to survive. It's not quite clear which settlement the man decided to journey to, though likely it would have been Bonnyville, as it was only a short distance away and could be reached considerably quickly. But what we do know is that several days later, a wagon packed with medical supplies and overflowing with volunteers rode into Fort Kent, ready to assist the dying population. Though, when they had arrived, they could have never predicted how void of life the town had become. Many of the volunteers had family here. It was unnerving to find the streets completely empty. The houses were all locked up. It was as if they had been hiding from something, presumably the sickness. The volunteers cried out, hoping for someone to respond to their calls. They listened, but only the faint buzzing of feasting flies could be heard. When approaching the doorsteps of the homes, the putrid odor of death and decay hung heavily in the vicinity of the buildings. It became easy to tell which dwellings hosted the rotting cadavers. A knock on each door would prove to produce very little in a response. It became clear, one after another, that they had arrived too late. The citizens of Fort Kent were all clearly dead. Realizing their fruitless hopes and efforts to save the population had passed, the group of volunteers realized they had just been handed a new mission, one they likely were hesitant on accepting. They could not simply leave the bodies of their neighbors rotting in their beds. They must be put to rest, and to do so, that required the group to enter the homes and remove the remains. The first couple houses were straightforward, nothing but the sickly sweet scent of death to catch them off guard. These folks had obviously perished due to the disease that had struck them. But upon venturing further down the street, the volunteers began to make several disturbing discoveries. While the residents they had already moved had obviously succumbed to their illness, these other ones certainly had not. Most were still confined to their beds, others were on the floor next to them. But something horrendous had taken place here. The volunteers began to find mutilated bodies of murdered victims. Blood was strewn about the room, soaking into the mattresses. Telltale signs of impacts covered the corpses, as if someone had taken a sharpened axe to them while they peacefully slept. Chunks of flesh had been savagely ripped out, partially eaten. Approximately 24 of Fort Kent's residents had been slain, a steep number in contrast to the already declining town. As the volunteers combed through the crime scene, it appeared that all the bodies of the townsfolk were accounted for. All except one. The body of Dr. Thomas Burton was yet to be found. The incoming investigation conducted by the officers of the Northwest Mounted Police concluded the people of Fort Kent had been viciously massacred by the lunatic doctor, whose shell-shocked mind couldn't stand to have lost his beloved wife. He had snapped, losing his thoughts and sensibility. Reality had rushed from his mind, only to be replaced by despair, guilt, and derangement. In the dead of night, he must have roamed from house to house, sneaking into the quiet shelters of his neighbors, and violently took out his anguish and misery upon them. Once his mission was complete, the man simply disappeared, wandering off into the nearby woods, only to be lost forever in the shadow of what he once was. Naturally, as news spread about the murders and missing surgeon, people across the region were shocked to hear that such horrors could have unfolded in what was once regarded as a safe and quaint community. The local Cree population, however, had an inkling of what may have truly transpired. Quiet rumors and soft whispers made in the dead of night suggested that the doctor, in his state of grief, became possessed by the Wendigo that had been said to haunt the northern wilderness. Undoubtedly, most folks had forgotten about the fearsome predator who had stalked the countryside, devouring grazing cattle or massacring wild game nearby due to the mysterious disease that had swept through Fort Kent. Little could anyone have expected, though, that this cannibalistic spirit was, all that time, hunting for a host. Suffering had surrounded Dr. Burton for quite some time. His wife's passing was the final slip that sent him down an endless spiral of despair. Once the Wendigo had discovered Burton was susceptible to possession, it refused to waste any time in sinking its blood-drenched claws into the vulnerable man's broken mind. As the once sympathetic doctor fell victim to the pervasive evil that now contaminated his soul, he became a twisted shell of what he once was and stood for. Under the overwhelming influence of the monster, he was forced to commit the most despicable of acts. The defenseless and weakened townsfolk were the perfect prey to satiate its gluttonous hunger. As the shadow of Thomas Burton descended upon the sleeping bodies of Fort Kent citizens, one after another he tore flesh from their bones, feasting to his heart's content. Come dawn, Dr. Burton excused himself from civilized society for the last time, slinking his way into the infinite expanse of wilderness to live out the rest of his life in solitude, with only the spirit of the Wendigo to keep him company. In November of 2003, the story regarding the Wendigo of Fort Kent and Dr. Burton's terrible demise was released on the airways as the second episode of the second season of the Canadian television program Creepy Canada, a series dedicated to the retelling and dramatization of various legends around the heart of the nation. Since the episode's release, the story of Fort Kent's Wendigo had become a favorite for fans of the macabre due to the graphic and violent depictions of its storyline. For years, people have believed it to have been an entirely true retelling, a horror story that unfolded in the prairies a century ago, but was only ever rarely spoken about a number of times since it happened. Could it have been the appalling nature of the story was what turned people away from it? Was it simply just too horrendous to speak of in the light of day, allowing this tale to be confined to the hidden chapters of history? In fact, contrary to what many online articles like to report, the mass murder and cannibalism that Thomas Burton was accused of back in the early winter months of 1920 never truly happened. An independent filmmaker and author by the name of Leslie Chivers birthed the legend of the Wendigo in Fort Kent back in autumn of 2002, a year prior to the release of the episode on Creepy Canada. Chivers, along with a friend named James, discovered Fort Kent by happenstance while researching creepy towns that could provide a proper setting for a horror movie. Fort Kent, as Chivers described it, was the creepiest town I've ever seen that was still surviving. The school was abandoned but not vandalized. The grass in the schoolyard grew to the bottoms of the windows, blowing soft waves in the wind. A girl's lone dirty shoe was turned over in the playground under a swing that rocked back and forth as though a child was still swinging in it. Across the street, an abandoned church stood. In front was a bronze statue of Jesus, which was missing its hands. Jesus looked up at the sky as if perhaps praying for his hands to return or praying for the salvation of Fort Kent. Chivers knew there was a story behind this nearly forgotten and desolate town in the middle of nowhere, and as it turned out, when he began researching the history of the region, found it to be littered with Wendigo accusations and convictions. Discovering this fact, Chivers realized he had an opportunity at his fingertips. Instinctively, the story of a Wendigo haunting the small town flowed through his mind and onto paper. Once the pillars of the tale were set, he got to work in launching a movie. He had purchased the equipment, sent out casting calls, and booked locations. Regrettably, though, he quickly ran out of money to fund the production of the feature film he called The Lost Town of Fort Kent. He was forced to cut costs and ultimately decided to turn the project into a mockumentary, and that's when the Discovery Channel came knocking. They didn't necessarily care about the facts behind the story. It was merely entertaining and downright frightening. It would make an excellent segment on Creepy Canada. Chivers decided to then run with it and keep the origins of the tale to himself up until 2014, when he wrote a blog post describing how he came up with the legend and the process of creating his failed film. Although his confession was noted by some, it was disregarded by many more. People weren't quite ready to believe such a thrilling and disturbing story could have been completely fabricated by one man. The segment on Creepy Canada didn't do the story any favors either by making it seem as if the disturbing legend was true. While responding to several interested fans on his blog, Leslie Chivers tells us many people embraced the tall tale. Those few who remain in the town came to resent it. Not all is lost knowing this story was false, however. It serves as an example for us to recognize that not everything we read on the internet or see on TV is exactly what it may appear to be. Sometimes, just simply doing a modicum of diligent research is all it takes to unravel a lingering mystery. Once again, I want to thank you all for listening to this episode on the Moonlight Lore podcast. I'm only realizing now, after having written and recorded this episode, that lately I've been covering a fair bit of hoaxes or untrue events, but I hope you all don't mind. The thing about this podcast is that it's transformed into a way for me to share stories and facts with you all. Not every story out there is going to be truthful or legitimate. I personally see it as a challenge to determine what might be false and what might be real. In this case of the Wendigo of Fort Kent, it was never real, despite many sources claiming that it was. That's part of the fun of this podcast, though, figuring out what truly happened or how something came to exist. So although I've been covering topics like this one, the Cottingley Fairies or the Kaiser Rex, which all turned out to be either a hoax or simply just a fabrication, I really hope you enjoy hearing these mysteries and history surrounding them regardless of an end result. I guess that is the motto of the podcast after all, a place where history meets mystery. We're always searching for the truth. If you happen to have enjoyed this particular disturbing episode or any other ones I've done in the past, once again I am coming to ask you for your support. I feel sort of like a broken record at this point, but it's always important to say at the end of the episode. Moonlight Lore has grown to become a fairly popular show in my opinion, far more popular than I had ever conceived it to be. And some of you might be wondering why I don't necessarily run advertisements on it. I've been approached a few times from different companies, but I've never really enjoyed ads myself, and I've always wanted to keep the show as ad-free as possible. Which is why I rely on your guys' support in donating to the Patreon each month. There are several perks you get when you sign up there, most notably access to bonus episodes the public doesn't get to hear. It's the best way to support the show, and all donations go towards the production costs like hosting fees, website costs, equipment, all that fun stuff that comes with running a free podcast. But I do know some people can't necessarily afford to support all their favorite shows at once. Your actions can be just as efficient. By sharing the podcast on social media or even telling your friends and family about it, it helps draw in new listeners and goes an incredibly long way in growing the show. Another option is to leave a 5-star review on whatever application you may be listening on right now. It only takes a second to do and goes just as far in making the podcast more visible on the podcast charts. For those of you who may be possibly listening on YouTube at the moment, be sure to like and subscribe to the show to catch more episodes in the future. Now that that's all out of the way, once again, I want to thank you all for listening to the show. I really do appreciate hearing how much many of you enjoy listening. It's always fun to hear from you all. I'm not sure when this episode is going to be released at the moment of my recording this. Hopefully as soon as possible, but it might have ended up being a tad bit late. Hopefully the delay wasn't too unbearable. But anyways, as always, keep being the awesome people I know you all are. Take care of one another out there, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care.